all of the energy that living things use to move around, to keep themselves from falling apart, to grow, to reproduce, all of this energy obviously has to come from somewhere. And on Earth, that somewhere, for almost all the energy, is the sun. There are some strange ecosystems deep under the ocean that build themselves up based on the energy that they extract from high energy chemical compounds bubbling up out of hydrothermal vents. But those are by far the exception to what is a very general rule. What this means, the fact that all the energy in living things comes ultimately from the sun, is that all of the energy has to pass through organisms that use photosynthesis. These organisms are called producers. Sometimes they're called primary producers. But these are the organisms that can capture the energy from light and store that energy in the form of high energy chemical bonds. Now, the amount of energy that is captured is called gross primary productivity. That's the amount of energy that is intercepted and actually captured by chlorophyll molecules. And it's usually expressed as a rate per area. So a certain area of a particular habitat is capturing energy at a particular rate. Okay, some of that energy, of course, is used. Plants have to use energy in order to do things like grow. They're constantly repairing themselves, carrying out cellular metabolism, and so forth. And all of that costs energy. No organism and no chemical reaction is 100% efficient. And so you do get a certain amount of loss of that energy as well. And one thing you need to know is that once the energy is used up, once it is lost, it's dissipated as heat. And that heat energy cannot be recaptured and used by any organism on Earth. For functional purposes, when that energy is used or it's lost to inefficiency, it is gone, and it's gone forever to all organisms. However, there is some energy that producers, these photosynthetic organisms, store in their tissues. Compounds particularly like sugar and starch have lots of high energy chemical bonds that can be built with an input of this solar energy. And so those chemical compounds become something like batteries that plants can draw on as they need to. To review, when plants perform photosynthesis, and also algae and photosynthetic bacteria, what they're doing is they're taking water and carbon dioxide and they're using the energy of sunlight to build glucose molecules with oxygen given off as a byproduct. So this is the end product of photosynthesis right here. From that glucose, there are all sorts of other carbon-containing compounds that can be built. You'll notice that this here is a hydrocarbon. It's mostly carbons bonded to hydrogens. Technically, it's a carbohydrate because it has oxygen molecules in it as well. And this is the basis that this is the foundational molecule that plants use to build things like amino acids, which are then used to build proteins. Wood is made up of these hydrocarbon molecules. It's an incredibly complex molecule that is structural rather than functional. But it's also made from lots of little glucoses. Same thing is true for starch. Starch is actually a lot of glucose molecules chained end to end. Cellulose is very similar. That's another structural molecule in plants. And even nucleic acids are mostly these carbon compounds stuck together to hydrogens, which are these high energy bonds. But basically everything that a plant is made of is generated by the process of photosynthesis generating glucose, which is then made into all of these things. The reason I'm going through these biochemical details is because I want to impress upon you that everything that a plant is made of comes from the energy that is captured through photosynthesis. And you need a certain amount of energy to make any of one of these components of a plant. Another way of saying the same thing is that every kilogram of plant matter requires a certain input of energy to make the raw material. That mass of plants is called plant biomass. In general, biomass is a term that we use when we're talking about the mass of living organisms. And for the purposes of understanding energy flow through ecosystems, you need to be able to think about biomass as basically representing a certain amount of energy, because there's a certain amount of energy that goes into making a kilogram of biomass. To get a kilogram of biomass built, you have to pay in a certain amount of energy. In reverse, a certain mass of living matter has a certain amount of energy in it. So every kilogram of biomass is like a battery that contains a certain amount of energy for organisms that might consume that biomass. Okay, when organisms consume biomass, it's these energy-rich carbon-based compounds that are being passed through the digestive system of the consumer, and as they're broken down, the energy that's in them can then be used by that consumer. So it's these physical molecules being passed from one organism to another that allow energy to flow through an ecosystem. And it's these energy-rich bonds, these high-energy bonds, that are essentially the energy storage mechanism by which energy is passed up a food chain. Not all of the energy that plants take in is available to consumers because they've lost some, because they've used some up. What is available, at least theoretically, is called net primary productivity. This is the amount of energy that producers store in their chemical bodies. Okay? Consumers, things like animals, like fungi, organisms that do not use photosynthesis, cannot generate their own energy. They have to get energy by taking it from other organisms, by consuming biomass. Okay? So just like gross primary productivity, net primary productivity is usually measured as a rate at which biomass is generated by producers in a particular area, like a square meter of a particular habitat. So the net primary productivity is the rate at which biomass is generated, because a pound of biomass basically means a certain amount of energy that is available to consumers. It is a little more complicated than that, because the exact chemicals that the biomass is made of influence how available that energy is to consumers. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, notice that the primary productivity and the amount of biomass that you actually see when you look in an ecosystem may not be the same. So over here, in this half of the slide, you've got a rainforest with a tremendous standing biomass. And if you look in a very productive marine ecosystem or a lake ecosystem, you might not see a lot of green. You might see a very different standing biomass. You'd see what seems to be a much lower standing biomass in the aquatic ecosystem. However, this aquatic ecosystem might have a really high primary productivity, even though you don't see much biomass. And the reason for that is that the biomass that is generated by producers in aquatic ecosystems tends all to be extremely edible. And so there's this very high turnover. It's consumed very rapidly. And the organisms that stick around a lot are actually generally the consumers, the ones at the higher trophic levels. And we'll get to what that means in a minute. But over here, most of the plant biomass is not available to consumers, and so you tend to get a very high standing biomass. The point is that the amount of biomass that you see when you look at a community may not reflect the rate at which biomass is actually being produced. You also have to take into the account the rate at which biomass is being consumed.